All right, I'm going to take you guys through The Fun of the Fair by Elizabeth Harrower, which is currently a Module C prescribed text. I don't go through a lot of analysis with these texts, and you don't need to, because the main idea is that you understand what stylistic features are being used by the composer, and then you're able to adopt those stylistic features into your own writing. That being said, it is really important to understand how the techniques have been used in the text itself, so that especially when you're doing your reflection statement, you don't just go, oh, they used this imagery, I used this imagery. It should be a little bit more detailed in relation to how they've done what they've done or why they've done what they've done. You don't need to quote from them, but there needs to be a little bit more detail about the reason for those techniques. And then, of course, you then go into your text, and in the reflection, you should use examples from yourself or your own writing to show how you've emulated the stylistic features of the text in question, or set text. So probably one of the biggest things that stands out with this particular text is the perspective. And one of the things I did want to mention as well is when you are looking at these texts, try to focus on macro techniques rather than micro techniques. And macro techniques are techniques that are present throughout the entire text, not just like one metaphor or one simile, something to do with like the whole structure, or something like a motif that is referred to multiple times throughout the actual text itself. So I'm going to be focusing on macro techniques because those are the ones that you should be adopting in your writing, and then obviously and analyzing for your reflection. So just going back to that, one of the key things that stands out is that there's this is written from a child's perspective. And you can see that right from the beginning with the melodramatic tone that is created, or the melodramatic descriptions that are created right from the outset. So as an example, up to her chin in water, she gave a little squeak of fear and curled her toes in the sandy floor so she wouldn't be washed away to the deep end. So that's sort of quite a childish tone there. Or out through the pipe that went under the rocks and into the ocean. The Pacific was just over there somewhere behind her. So that notion of it being like, out through the pipe, like pretty unlikely. Could happen, maybe. But even from the opening, as if the lightning that ripped the sky apart wasn't enough, the lights around the edge of the swimming pool, and even 3 big ones sunk into the cement piles, went out. So the lightning ripping the sky apart, like it is a little bit dramatic to say ripping the sky apart. She talks about it was nothing so much as that astronomical darkness into which she had been plunged last year when they took out her tonsils. So that's probably the best one, actually. Maybe I should have started with that one. But yes, you do have this almost melodramatic description here, where saying that the darkness was astronomical, etc. So and then as you go, you do see bits and pieces of that tone keep recurring, when she's talking about the giants, etc. But basically, that establishes a perspective which is prevalent throughout. So linking that to the perspective that you're creating for your key character, so you would say something like, similar to the way that Elizabeth Harrower creates a child's perspective through a melodramatic tone to reflect the journey of this individual, like, here's what I've done, and then here's my quote. Right, so that's the first one I want to talk about. The second thing to note here is there's a pathetic fallacy that's continued throughout. So pathetic fallacy is basically when you use the weather to reflect a sense of emotion. And that's used a couple of times. So we actually already gave an example of that. So as if the lightning that ripped the sky apart wasn't enough. So something, quite dramatic there again, but like it's talking about the lightning. There are a couple of times where, in the, and she wants her approval from her uncle that like, oh, can you let auntie know that like I was really good in the dark and the lightning? And, she kind of refers back to that. She's also talking about, and actually this is another motif, which sort of links to pathetic fallacy when it's talking about weather, but it's also water. So Layla laughed and so did Janet till the stinging of her shoulders made her drift into deeper water and stand with her back covered up, listening to the rain. Okay, coming back to rain, beating against her bathing cap the way it beat on the windows and roof when she was at home in bed. It was almost cozy. So there's this way that like pathetic fallacy is used, or the weather is used to sort of illustrate that sense of like, oh my gosh, confrontation, the lightning, scary, but then also this sense of like comfort, listening to the rain beating, and then that being like at home in bed, right? So there's this like dualistic or almost paradoxical way that pathetic fallacy is used, and also that recurrence of water. So yeah, so either one of those could work there. I kind of like the pathetic fallacy one. So, you could say, obviously Elizabeth Harrower uses that. And then you could use pathetic fallacy as a recurring motif in your writing, which I think is a really good technique to use, because when you're describing a particular emotion and then you're linking it to the weather, and you're sort of able to describe how the persona is feeling through the weather that is happening at that time, or at various moments throughout, where there will definitely be a contrast. So you want to have the experience of entrapment and the experience of freedom. I've said that in a couple of my videos. Those are two really key themes that work extremely well for this module. So have the sense of entrapment be reflected through the use of pathetic fallacy. So what kind of weather do you think, and try not to be too cliche about it, but what kind of like weather or description or something could you include for, a feeling of entrapment versus a feeling of freedom? And it also really depends on how you describe it. So something like the rain beating against her bathing cap, like rain beating doesn't normally sound like something that would be like of comfort, but then because she says the way it beat on the windows and roof when she was at home in bed, it sort of turns it into that feeling of comfort. So you don't have to be like, oh, I'm sad, so it's raining. Like, that's a bit cliche, but you could, talk about rain and have it be linked to, a feeling of comfort, the way that obviously it's been done here. So, you can play around with it, but that's a really good technique that she uses. Then we've got this like transformation of the individual, and that's a really important one, or at least a contrast in her persona throughout the story. And that's something you should really be including in any story that you do, where there's sort of a challenge that someone's facing and then some kind of change they undergo. The ending is left fairly ambiguous. We don't really know where she's like running off to and why she exactly got so upset, frankly. I mean, obviously something happened with the giant shaking her hand and, she freaked out. But either way, she starts off by being like, oh, I really want to be here, and this is a treat, and it's my birthday, and oh, tell auntie I was good so I get to do it again. And then she's like, that's it, I don't love any of you, which, as you can hear, there's like that childish tone sort of coming in there, like that drama of like, oh, well, that's it, I'm upset, so I hate everybody. I think we'll be there. So, that's potentially where it's ended. But either way, you do see a shift in tone where she's really desperate for that approval from, her uncle and her auntie and, so on. And then at the end, she's just like, that's it, I don't need you anymore, I'm off. So that's an important one to note, because like the description she has, or that's in here, does reflect that change. And so you see definitely at the very end, like there's that shift from crying to now brilliant-eyed. Okay, so she's got this new invigorated sense of like energy to run off somewhere else and whatever it is. So, but yeah, there is that contrast and that change that you can see. So that's another one in terms of like the characterization. So that's a pretty good macro technique as well when you explore that. And I just wanted to highlight a particular passage. I just love some of the description that's used here. And it's really good for you to try and emulate some of the description, because it can be tricky to like show and not tell. We hear that all the time, but I love this module because it does give you a better idea of how, like, what kind of writing is good, and gives the reader like a vivid understanding of like gives them a picture in their mind. Basically, that's what they're going for. So I love that you can sort of read something and then emulate it without, obviously you're not copying it. You're going to have your own version of it, but it's still nice to be able to like, use something to emulate, if that makes sense. So example, so this is on page 4. So obediently the girls looked, saw the storm clouds, spent tearing away from the moon, racing out to sea. So a couple of things that we saw there again, like the storm clouds, pathetic fallacy, tearing away from the moon, racing out to sea. This had been a day of heat, humidity, and choking dust. Now the air was fresh, still warm, but clear and smelling of the sea. So why I wanted to highlight that particular section is that when you're doing your writing, you don't want to have a lot of events going on. I mean, obviously this is a lot longer than what you're going to get the chance to write. I'm really only looking for 500 words if it's out of 10, maybe 800 words if you don't have a reflection for some reason and you've got to write a longer creative. But even then, really, like 800 words is probably enough based on being able to link to the stimulus, etc. So when you've got a much shorter story that you have to do, you need to make sure there isn't a whole lot going on, so that you can have some really good description. And, you know, you can see the amount of detail that's gone into describing moments. And that's the real thing I want to emphasize. This is all about moments of description, and that's what should be in your piece. So what I always like as a structure is to have a person maybe in a current like setting, where there's like that sense of, you know, create that setting. You've got that pathetic fallacy. It reflects the emotional state of the persona that you're describing. Then maybe have a flashback to another scene, another moment in time, which contrasts the current one where you have a sense of like entrapment. You know, so maybe the beginning could be like, oh, indecision and not sure what to do. And then you have the setting and the weather and all that reflect that feeling of uncertainty. Then you have a flashback to feeling trapped, like what's going on, what difficulty, what challenges is person facing. And then the last thing coming back to the present again, where there may be some sort of like resolution or some kind of like freedom that they're trying to attain. So, and another thing to do, and I talk about this a lot in my videos as well, is have a metafictive motif where you've got a person who's writing about writing, or you're writing about someone painting or creating music or something, you know. So having that compositional motif where maybe at the beginning where you've got that feeling of uncertainty, they're like trying to write in a journal and they can't get it out, and you know that you describe that struggle along with the setting and so forth. And then maybe at the end there's this sense of like freedom where it all flows because whatever, they've achieved that sense of freedom through the composition that they're doing. And, you know, we don't need to know what that is. As you can see, there's a very like ambiguous ending here. So you don't need to like answer all the questions there, and it's a short piece. But having those elements in there will give you a lot to go on in terms of just incorporating a stimulus, you know, and then when you've got your reflection statement in here where you're talking about how you've used the fun of the fair, you've got a couple of good techniques there. So hopefully that gives you some good techniques just to kind of sum that up again. We had the child's perspective, especially created through the dramatic or melodramatic tone. You've got the motif of pathetic fallacy, so motif obviously used throughout. You've got the motif of water. You've got the vivid imagery, but I don't feel like you necessarily need to reflect on that in the reflection statement. I think you should just use that in your writing. And you've got that structural transformation of the central character. So you've got like her being quite obedient at the beginning and then seeking that strong approval to being like rebellious and resolved. So maybe there's a sense of, I don't know, like adolescence coming about here. Like she's hit that 10, like double digits, whatever. And then you know, potentially got that ambiguous ending as well, which sort of links to that, you know, that transformation, that structural transformation. So those are my top picks for macro techniques for this particular text. And so see how you can incorporate those into your own writing when you're using this one as a set text.